He had just come in for a bite to eat, but the biker gang decided he was an easy target. They laughed, provoked, and eventually went after him with their fists. But after a few seconds, it was clear they'd picked the wrong victim. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The road stretched out ahead, long and empty, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the barren landscape. The headlights of the lone vehicle cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust that drifted lazily across the road in the still night air. The desert lay sprawled on either side, a vast and indifferent expanse under the deep navy sky. Somewhere in the distance, the faint glimmer of a neon sign flickered, beckoning like a lone lighthouse on a sea of emptiness. Sitting behind the wheel, Sylvester Stallone barely registered the distant lights. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, the gentle hum of the engine the only company he had. He wasn't in a hurry. There was nowhere to be. No set destination. Just the road, the car, and the quiet that came with solitude. That was all he wanted tonight. The radio crackled softly, catching snippets of an old country song before losing signal again. He reached out, turned the knob, but it was no use. The static was the only thing filling the speakers now. With a quiet sigh, he switched it off and let the silence settle. It suited him. A few more miles passed before he finally took notice of the neon sign ahead. The diner sat at the side of the road, its parking lot mostly empty. A few scattered cars were parked near the entrance, a battered pickup truck, an old sedan, and, most noticeably, a cluster of motorcycles lined up near the side. Big, heavy bikes with dark, weathered paint and chrome gleaming in the dim light. Even from a distance, he could tell they belonged to a club. He didn't think much of it. He'd been around long enough to know the kind. Some biker gangs were bad news, sure, but not all of them. Most just kept to themselves, living by their own codes, only causing trouble when they felt like they had to. He wasn't worried. He had no reason to be. Pulling into the lot, he killed the engine and sat for a moment, watching the glow of the flickering diner sign reflected in his windshield. The place looked old, but well kept, the kind of roadside joint that had been standing for decades, serving the same greasy food to weary travelers who barely remembered it once they were gone. Places like this had a way of existing outside of time. The night air was still warm when he stepped out of the car. The scent of fried food and coffee drifted out from the building as he approached. The neon light buzzed faintly above the door, its glow casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote let out a lonely howl before the silence swallowed it again. As he pushed open the door, the familiar chime of a bell rang out above him, cutting through the quiet murmur of the diner. The air inside was thick with the scent of grease and coffee, the kind of smell that clung to the walls and settled into the very bones of the place. The linoleum floor was worn, scuffed from years of use, and the booths had seen better days, their vinyl seats cracked with age. A handful of patrons were scattered throughout. A couple of truckers sat hunched over their meals, keeping to themselves. An older man near the counter nursed a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the small television mounted on the wall, where a baseball game flickered in and out of static. But it was the group in the back that caught his attention. The bikers sat in the corner, their presence impossible to ignore. There were 6 of them, all dressed in worn leather and denim, patches sewn into their jackets displaying the emblem of their club. Black Wolves. He recognized the name. They had a reputation, not the worst of their kind, but not the best either. The kind of men who thrived on intimidation, who took what they wanted when they thought no one could stop them. One of them glanced up as Stallone entered, nudging the man beside him. The others followed his gaze, and for a brief moment, the conversation at their table quieted. Then one of them snorted, muttering something under his breath, and the rest of them chuckled, returning to their drinks. Stallone didn't react. He'd seen it before. He walked past them without a glance, making his way to an empty booth near the window. The waitress appeared a moment later, a young woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile. She set down a menu, but he barely glanced at it. "Coffee," he said, "and a steak." She nodded, jotting it down, but there was something in her demeanor, an unease. He could tell she was trying not to look toward the back of the diner, but her body betrayed her. The way her shoulders tensed, the way she moved quickly, like she wanted to be anywhere but here. He had just come in for a bite to eat, but the biker gang decided he was an easy target. They laughed, provoked, and eventually went after him with their fists. But after a few seconds, it was clear they'd picked the wrong victim. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The road stretched out ahead, long and empty, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the barren landscape. The headlights of the lone vehicle cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust that drifted lazily across the road in the still night air. The desert lay sprawled on either side, a vast and indifferent expanse under the deep navy sky. Somewhere in the distance, the faint glimmer of a neon sign flickered, beckoning like a lone lighthouse on a sea of emptiness. Sitting behind the wheel, Sylvester Stallone barely registered the distant lights. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, the gentle hum of the engine the only company he had. He wasn't in a hurry. There was nowhere to be. No set destination. Just the road, the car, and the quiet that came with solitude. That was all he wanted tonight. The radio crackled softly, catching snippets of an old country song before losing signal again. He reached out, turned the knob, but it was no use. The static was the only thing filling the speakers now. With a quiet sigh, he switched it off and let the silence settle. It suited him. A few more miles passed before he finally took notice of the neon sign ahead. The diner sat at the side of the road, its parking lot mostly empty. A few scattered cars were parked near the entrance, a battered pickup truck, an old sedan, and, most noticeably, a cluster of motorcycles lined up near the side. Big, heavy bikes with dark, weathered paint and chrome gleaming in the dim light. Even from a distance, he could tell they belonged to a club. He didn't think much of it. He'd been around long enough to know the kind. Some biker gangs were bad news, sure, but not all of them. Most just kept to themselves, living by their own codes, only causing trouble when they felt like they had to. He wasn't worried. He had no reason to be. Pulling into the lot, he killed the engine and sat for a moment, watching the glow of the flickering "Diner" sign reflected in his windshield. The place looked old, but well kept, the kind of roadside joint that had been standing for decades, serving the same greasy food to weary travelers who barely remembered it once they were gone. Places like this had a way of existing outside of time. The night air was still warm when he stepped out of the car. The scent of fried food and coffee drifted out from the building as he approached. The neon light buzzed faintly above the door, its glow casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote let out a lonely howl before the silence swallowed it again. As he pushed open the door, the familiar chime of a bell rang out above him, cutting through the quiet murmur of the diner. The air inside was thick with the scent of grease and coffee, the kind of smell that clung to the walls and settled into the very bones of the place. The linoleum floor was worn, scuffed from years of use, and the booths had seen better days, their vinyl seats cracked with age. A handful of patrons were scattered throughout. A couple of truckers sat hunched over their meals, keeping to themselves. An older man near the counter nursed a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the small television mounted on the wall where a baseball game flickered in and out of static. But it was the group in the back that caught his attention. The bikers sat in the corner, their presence impossible to ignore. There were 6 of them, all dressed in worn leather and denim, patches sewn into their jackets displaying the emblem of their club. Black Wolves. He recognized the name. They had a reputation, not the worst of their kind, but not the best either. The kind of men who thrived on intimidation, who took what they wanted when they thought no one could stop them. One of them glanced up as Stallone entered, nudging the man beside him. The others followed his gaze, and for a brief moment, the conversation at their table quieted. Then one of them snorted, muttering something under his breath, and the rest of them chuckled, returning to their drinks. Stallone didn't react. He'd seen it before. He walked past them without a glance, making his way to an empty booth near the window. The waitress appeared a moment later, a young woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile. She set down a menu, but he barely glanced at it. "Coffee," he said, "and a steak." She nodded, jotting it down, but there was something in her demeanor, an unease. He could tell she was trying not to look toward the back of the diner, but her body betrayed her. The way her shoulders tensed, the way she moved quickly, like she wanted to be anywhere but here. Silence. Stallone finished his coffee, set the cup down, and picked up his knife, cutting another piece of steak. The laughter faltered just a little. The leader's grin thinned. "Maybe he just ain't got anything to say," one of the others said. "Maybe he's just another washed-up tough guy playing pretend." The laughter returned, louder this time. Stallone still didn't react, but the waitress did. She had been trying to keep her head down, trying to ignore it like everyone else, but something about the way they spoke, the way they were pushing, made her stop. Her hand tightened around the coffee pot, her knuckles going white. The leader noticed. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his tone shifting, turning playful. "Why don't you bring us another round? And give us a smile while you're at it. Ain't polite to serve a man without looking him in the eye." The others chuckled. The waitress hesitated, then started toward their table, her shoulders stiff. But before she could take another step, the leader reached out and grabbed her wrist. Not hard, not yet, but enough to make her stop. Enough to make it clear that she wasn't walking away until he let her. A ripple of unease moved through the diner. Stallone set down his knife. The leader grinned, oblivious to the shift in the air, to the way the room had suddenly gone still. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his grip tightening just slightly. "Give us a smile." The waitress tried to pull back. "Let me go." The leader chuckled. "Not until you—" The door to the diner opened. The night air swept in, carrying the scent of asphalt and dust, rattling the sugar jars on the counter. For the first time, the leader hesitated. His fingers loosened just slightly, his eyes flicking toward the movement at the door. Stallone pushed back his chair and stood. It was a simple movement. No sudden gestures, no threats, but somehow it changed everything. The laughter stopped. The low murmur of conversation died. The leader's smile twitched. For the first time that night, he wasn't the one in control. Stallone met his eyes. No words, just a look. The leader let go of the waitress. She took a step back, her breath unsteady. The silence stretched. The leader straightened in his seat, his grin returning, forced now, tinged with something he wasn't used to feeling. Uncertainty. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like the tough guy finally decided to join us." His voice was steady, but his fingers twitched. The others watched, waiting, the mood shifting, the tension rising again. Stallone didn't speak, didn't move, didn't have to, because in that moment, everyone in the diner, every trucker, every patron, every last one of the Black Wolves understood something the leader had been too slow to realize. He had just picked a fight with the wrong man. The silence in the diner stretched, thick and unyielding. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone inside. Stallone stood by his booth, his gaze locked onto the man with the scar. The leader of the Black Wolves still had that smirk plastered across his face, but it no longer carried the same ease, the same effortless arrogance. The room had shifted, and for the first time he wasn't entirely sure where he stood. His fingers tapped idly against the surface of the table, his movements slower now, more deliberate. The other bikers were still watching, their expressions caught between amusement and something else, something that wasn't quite fear, but close enough to make them hesitate. They had expected the usual response. A nervous chuckle, a muttered excuse, maybe even an attempt to defuse the situation. What they hadn't expected was silence. The waitress had backed away, rubbing her wrist where the leader had grabbed her. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said enough. Gratitude. And something else. Relief. She knew what kind of men these were. She had been waiting for the moment when someone, anyone, would put a stop to it. Stallone finally moved, reaching for his coffee cup. He lifted it slowly, took a sip, then set it back down with a quiet clink. The sound felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. Then, without looking away from the leader, he spoke. "I don't like repeating myself." His voice was calm, steady. Not loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut through the room, slicing straight through the false bravado that hung over the Black Wolves like a fog. The leader's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for the men around him to notice. He could feel their eyes on him now, waiting to see how he would respond. He couldn't back down, not in front of them. With a slow, exaggerated sigh, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His fingers interlaced, his grin widening again, forced now, stretched too thin. He wanted to make this look like a joke, like he was still the one in control. "Relax, old man," he drawled. "We're just having some fun." His tone was casual, almost friendly, but his eyes told a different story. He was waiting for an opening, for something he could twist into an excuse to escalate. Stallone gave him nothing. The leader's fingers drummed against the tabletop. He could feel the control slipping, and he hated it. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a crooked nose and tattoos creeping up his neck, shifted in his seat, restless. "Maybe he doesn't hear so good," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to catch. The leader chuckled, picking up on the thread. "Yeah, maybe that's it," he said, tilting his head. "Maybe we should help him out." The others laughed, the tension breaking just a little. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the leader knocked over Stallone's coffee. The cup toppled, spilling dark liquid across the table, dripping onto the floor. A quiet gasp came from behind the counter, but no one else moved. The laughter had died again. Stallone looked down at the spreading pool of coffee. Slowly, deliberately, he picked up a napkin, dabbing at the mess with the same unhurried calm as before. The leader was watching him closely now, his smirk sharpening. "Oops," he said, feigning innocence. "Guess you weren't quick enough to stop that, huh?" The bikers chuckled, but it was quieter this time, more uncertain. Stallone set the napkin down. Then he lifted his gaze, meeting the leader's eyes again. "You should clean that up." The words weren't a request. They weren't loud, weren't laced with anger, but they carried weight, heavier than anything the leader had been expecting. For the first time, real hesitation flickered across his face. Then, almost as quickly as it had come, it was gone. He let out a short, sharp laugh, throwing his arms out like this was all just a big joke. "You hear that?" he said to his men. "He wants me to clean it up." A few chuckled, but it was weaker now, lacking the same bite. The leader turned back to Stallone, his grin still in place but his patience wearing thin. "You got some balls, old man," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Maybe I ought to knock that tough guy act right out of you." His fingers curled into fists, his body leaning forward, the threat fully formed now. The moment they had all been waiting for. The rest of the diner had gone silent. The truckers weren't moving. The waitress was frozen behind the counter, her hand gripping the edge like it might keep her grounded. Stallone didn't flinch, didn't move. Then, just as quietly as before, he spoke. "You don't want to do that." The words sent another ripple through the room. The bikers stiffened, exchanging quick glances. They had been in plenty of fights before, had taken on plenty of men who thought they were tough. But this wasn't the same. The way Stallone said it, the way he sat, completely at ease, the way he hadn't even looked at the coffee soaking into his jeans. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a challenge. It was something worse. Certainty. The leader swallowed, barely noticeable, but Stallone caught it. Pride was a hell of a thing. The leader couldn't back down now, not with all those eyes on him. He straightened, shaking off whatever instinct had told him to stop. "Yeah?" he sneered, stepping closer. "And why's that?" Stallone exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. His body moved with the kind of ease that only came from years of experience, muscle memory honed over decades. He wasn't tense. He wasn't bracing for a fight. He was just getting ready. The leader didn't see it. He was too blinded by his own anger, his own need to prove something. He stepped in closer, fists clenching. "What's the matter, old man?" he pressed. "You scared yet?" Stallone almost smiled, not even a little. The leader moved, a quick, sharp motion, a fist flying forward aimed at Stallone's jaw, a mistake. Because in the space of a heartbeat, Stallone wasn't there. He shifted, a simple, practiced movement, just enough to let the punch cut through empty air. The leader's own momentum worked against him, sending him stumbling forward, off balance. Before he could recover, Stallone's hand shot out, catching his wrist. Then he twisted. The movement was fast, precise, an instant reversal that sent a shockwave of pain up the leader's arm, forcing him to his knees with a choked grunt. The entire diner inhaled as one. The leader barely had time to register what had happened before his face hit the floor. A second passed, then another. Stallone let go. The leader stayed down. The bikers were silent. Stallone finally straightened, adjusting his jacket, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and sat back down. He picked up his fork, and he kept eating. The leader of the Black Wolves remained on the floor for a moment, his breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. His wrist throbbed, the dull ache radiating up his arm, a reminder of just how quickly everything had changed. He had thought this would be simple. A little intimidation, a little fun at the expense of an aging actor who had spent more time in front of a camera than in a real fight. But now, as he pushed himself up onto his elbows, he realized just how wrong he had been. Stallone, meanwhile, had already gone back to his meal. The weight of the moment had already shifted away from the leader, settling squarely on the other bikers who still sat frozen in place. Their leader had gone down fast, too fast. They hadn't even seen how it happened. One moment, he had been standing tall, full of cocky bravado, and the next, he was on the ground, gasping like a fish out of water. The truckers at the counter sat rigid, their forks hovering above their plates. The waitress stood behind the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the surface, her breathing shallow. The entire diner was watching, waiting. The leader let out a sharp breath, shaking his head as he rolled his shoulder. His pride burned hotter than the pain in his wrist. He spat onto the floor and slowly got to his feet, flexing his fingers, trying to push past the sting. "Lucky shot," he muttered, but the words sounded weak even to him. One of his men shifted in his seat, glancing between him and Stallone, who hadn't even bothered to look up. Another biker, a thick-necked brute with a shaved head, scoffed under his breath. "You gonna let that slide, Red?" The leader, Red, bristled at the name. He had built his reputation on being untouchable, the kind of man no one messed with. His crew had seen him take down bigger men, meaner men, men who knew how to fight. But this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He straightened his jacket, forcing a grin. "Yeah," he said, rolling his shoulders. "I think the old man's got a little fight in him. Maybe he forgot who he's talking to." The others chuckled, but it was forced now, uneasy. Red turned towards Stallone, who still hadn't moved, hadn't reacted in the slightest. That calm, that absolute lack of concern, it made his blood boil. He had to take control back, had to remind his men who he was. Without another word, he reached for Stallone's plate and shoved it off the table. The ceramic shattered against the floor, steak and potatoes splattered across the linoleum. The silence in the room deepened. Stallone exhaled slowly. Not a sigh of frustration, not a gasp of anger, just a long, patient breath, as if he had been expecting this all along. He wiped his mouth with his napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. Then, finally, he looked up. His eyes met Red's, and whatever confidence had been left in the biker's face flickered. That gaze. It was the kind of look a man gave when he had already won. Red swallowed, barely noticeable, but Stallone caught it. Then he moved. It was quick, too fast for Red to react. Before the biker could step back, Stallone grabbed the front of his jacket and pulled, yanking him forward with effortless strength. Red barely had time to gasp before Stallone's fist drove into his stomach. The air left his lungs in an instant, his body folding inward as pain exploded through his ribs. He staggered, gasping, but Stallone didn't let go. The next hit came faster, an elbow to the jaw. The impact snapped Red's head back, sending him crashing onto the table behind him. The wood groaned under his weight as he sprawled against it, dazed. Then the diner erupted. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as the rest of the bikers shot to their feet. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally snapped, and the black wolves surged forward as one, their hesitation burned away by the heat of anger and instinct. Stallone stepped back, his body loose, his stance shifting ever so slightly. He had seen this coming. He had been waiting for it. The first man reached him, a heavy-set brute with a wild grin throwing a punch meant to take Stallone's head off. It missed. Stallone moved just enough to let the fist sail past his face, then drove his knee up into the biker's stomach. The man's breath left him in a wheezing grunt, and before he could recover, Stallone hooked a hand behind his neck and sent him sprawling face first onto the counter. A second biker came in from the side, swinging a chair. The movement was sloppy, too telegraphed. Stallone ducked. The chair whistled past, smashing against a table, sending wood splinters flying. Before the biker could correct his balance, Stallone grabbed the back of his head and drove him forward into the same table. The impact rattled the salt shakers and knocked over someone's abandoned cup of coffee. Another man lunged, a switchblade flashing in the diner's dim lighting. Stallone caught the wrist before the blade could reach him, twisted sharply, and the knife clattered to the floor. The biker barely had time to process what had happened before Stallone drove a palm strike into his chest, sending him staggering backward into a booth. The rest of the gang hesitated now, the fight bleeding out of them as quickly as it had begun. Red was groaning, clutching his ribs. The man Stallone had thrown into the counter wasn't moving. The one with the knife was still gasping for breath, his chest heaving. The waitress hadn't moved. Neither had the truckers. It had all happened too fast. Red coughed, spitting blood onto the floor. His breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps as he pushed himself up, shaking his head. Son of a... He didn't finish. Stallone turned toward him, slow, deliberate. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Red's jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists, but he didn't move. He wasn't an idiot. The others were watching now, waiting for him to say something to give them an order. But there was nothing left to say. Stallone hadn't just won. He had ended it before it even started. Red swore under his breath, pushing himself to his feet. His knees wobbled, but he stayed upright. He looked around, taking in the damage, the overturned tables, the shattered chair, his men groaning on the floor. He met Stallone's gaze one last time. Then he turned. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice thick with humiliation. One by one, the bikers followed. A few shot Stallone dark looks, but none of them tried anything else. The door swung open, letting in the night air, and then they were gone. The diner remained silent. The waitress let out a shaky breath, her fingers still gripping the counter. The truckers stared at Stallone, their expressions hovering somewhere between disbelief and awe. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Then he stepped forward, reached into his pocket, and tossed a few bills onto the counter. "For the plate," he said simply. Then he turned and walked out, leaving behind the smell of spilled coffee, broken wood, and a lesson the Black Wolves wouldn't forget. The night air hit him as soon as he stepped outside, cool and dry, carrying the scent of asphalt and distant sagebrush. The roar of engines faded as the Black Wolves disappeared down the highway, their taillights flickering in the dark. Stallone stood for a moment, his hands resting on his hips, watching until they were swallowed by the horizon. He had seen men like them before, loud, brash, convinced they owned every room they walked into. The kind of men who thrived on intimidation and numbers, who thought fear was the same thing as respect. But fear had its limits. Behind him, the door of the diner creaked open. The waitress stepped out cautiously, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked at Stallone, then down the road as if making sure the bikers were really gone. A deep breath shuddered out of her. "You okay?" she asked. Stallone glanced at her, nodded. "Fine." She swallowed, glancing back toward the diner. "I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that." Stallone didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had just happened. The soft hum of insects filled the night, the occasional rustle of wind brushing through the empty parking lot. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came the sound of engines. Stallone's jaw tightened. He turned, listening. The waitress stiffened beside him. "No," she murmured, "no way." But the sound grew louder, the low growl of motorcycles rolling back down the highway, cutting through the silence of the desert. They were coming back. Stallone exhaled, slow and measured. He had figured Red wasn't the type to take a loss easily. Men like him didn't know how to let things go. The waitress took a step back toward the door. "You should get out of here," she said quickly, before— "Go inside," Stallone interrupted. His voice was calm, steady, but there was no room for argument. The waitress hesitated for a split second, then nodded and disappeared back into the diner, the door swinging shut behind her. The rumble of motorcycles filled the air now, growing closer, more distinct. Then headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the lot as the bikes pulled in. They were more this time, at least a dozen. Stallone watched as they came to a stop, the engines dying one by one, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the crackling of cooling metal. Red was the last to dismount. He moved slower than before, his body stiff, still feeling the effects of their last encounter. His face was tight with pain, but his eyes burned with something else. Humiliation, rage. He took a step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel. His men spread out behind him, surrounding Stallone in a loose half-circle. They weren't playing anymore. Red rolled his shoulders, flexing his fingers. "I should have known you wouldn't just be some washed-up actor." His voice was rough, low. "Should have figured you were the real deal." Stallone didn't answer. Red's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "But here's the thing," he continued. "I don't give a damn who you are. I don't care how many fights you've been in or how many tough guys you've dropped. Because this—" he gestured around them. "This ain't the movies." A few of the bikers chuckled. The tension in the air thickened. Red reached into his jacket. When his hand came back out, it wasn't empty. A length of heavy chain dangled from his fingers, the metal links clinking softly. Stallone didn't move. Red swung the chain once, letting it loop lazily through the air. "See, you got lucky back there," he said. "Caught me off guard. Won't happen again." The others started shifting now, spreading out, cutting off any possible escape. Not that Stallone was planning to run. Red's grip tightened around the chain. His breathing was heavier now, his knuckles white. "You should have just let it go." Then he moved. The chain lashed out, slicing through the air towards Stallone's head. He ducked. The metal links whistled past, missing him by inches. Before Red could recover, Stallone closed the distance, catching his wrist in an iron grip. A sharp twist. Red grunted, his arm wrenched sideways, the chain slipping from his grasp. Stallone didn't let go. With a quick pivot, he drove his elbow into Red's jaw. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his boots skidding against the gravel. The others hesitated. Then, all at once, they rushed him. The first man came in fast, throwing a wild punch. Stallone dodged, caught the biker's arm, and yanked him forward using his own momentum against him. The man crashed onto the hood of a car, the breath leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. Another attacked from the side, swinging a crowbar. Stallone sidestepped, grabbed the weapon mid-swing, and wrenched it free. He turned it against its owner, striking him across the ribs. The biker let out a strangled curse and collapsed to his knees. A third lunged, a knife flashing in his grip. Stallone moved faster. A sharp kick to the wrist sent the blade spinning through the air. The biker barely had time to register his loss before Stallone drove a knee into his stomach, doubling him over. More came. They were bigger, younger, stronger, but they weren't faster. They weren't trained. They relied on brute force, on intimidation, on their numbers. None of it mattered. A fist flew toward him. He caught it, twisted. A scream. Someone swung a bat. He stepped inside the arc, delivered a sharp elbow to the temple. Bodies fell around him, groaning, writhing. Some didn't get back up. Then there was only Red. He was breathing hard, his hands shaking, his face a mask of barely contained fury. His gang was down. His pride was shattered, but he had come too far to stop now. He charged. Stallone let him come. At the last moment, he sidestepped, grabbed the back of Red's jacket, and sent him sprawling face first into the dirt. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Red coughed, groaning as he rolled onto his side. His face was streaked with blood and dust, his chest rising and falling in ragged heaves. He stared up at Stallone, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he laughed. A low, bitter sound, full of something Stallone had heard before. Resignation, defeat. Red spit blood onto the ground, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered. "I really thought." He trailed off, exhaling sharply. Stallone didn't say anything. Red's laughter faded. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, wincing. His men were still groaning, still struggling to get up. He let out a long breath. Then he nodded. A small, almost imperceptible gesture. Without another word, he turned toward his bike. One by one, the others followed. Engines rumbled back to life, headlights flickering on. They didn't look back. Stallone watched as they pulled out of the lot, disappearing once again down the highway. But this time, they wouldn't be coming back. He stood there for a long moment, listening as the night swallowed the last echoes of their departure. Then he turned, walked back toward the diner, and stepped inside. Inside the diner, the silence was as thick as the scent of coffee and grease that clung to the air. Every set of eyes in the room was locked onto Stallone as he stepped back through the door, his boots scuffing softly against the linoleum floor. The fluorescent lights above hummed, casting a dull, flickering glow over the overturned chairs and shattered plates still scattered across the ground. No one spoke. No one moved. The waitress stood behind the counter, her hands still gripping the edge as if letting go might make the world tilt out of balance. Her breath came shallow and uneven, her wide eyes flicking between Stallone and the empty parking lot outside, as if waiting for the rumble of engines to return. But the only sound now was the faint crackle of the radio in the corner, still tuned to a forgotten station where a country song played softly beneath the hum of electricity. One of the truckers, an older man with a thick mustache and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, finally stirred. He reached for his coffee cup with a slow, measured motion, as if testing whether the air had truly settled. He took a sip, set it back down, and let out a quiet exhale. "Well," he muttered, shaking his head, "I'll be damned." That was all it took. The tension in the room unraveled just a little, the moment breaking like a glass filled too high. One of the other truckers let out a low whistle. A third chuckled under his breath, shaking his head in something that might have been disbelief or respect. The waitress still hadn't moved. Stallone met her eyes, nodding once, a silent reassurance. She swallowed, her grip on the counter loosening, her shoulders sagging as the weight of the night finally started to drain from her limbs. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, but it took her a second too long. "Yeah," she said, her voice hoarse. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. I thought they were going to kill you." Stallone didn't answer, not because he didn't have one, but because there was nothing to say that would make a difference. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, setting them down on the counter. "For the damage?" he said simply. The waitress blinked at the money, then back at him. "You don't have to." "I know." She hesitated, then nodded. Behind them, the man with the mustache leaned back in his seat, arms crossing over his chest. "You know," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen his share of fights in places just like this, "most men wouldn't have walked out of that alive." Stallone turned to him but said nothing. The trucker nodded, more to himself than anyone else. "Damn good thing you ain't most men." The diner settled back into something resembling normalcy. The truckers went back to their meals, conversations starting up again in quiet murmurs, though none of them had quite shaken off what they had just witnessed. The waitress moved to start cleaning up the broken dishes, her hands still unsteady but her movements more sure than before. Outside, the highway stretched on into the darkness, empty once more. But Stallone knew better than to think this was over. Red wasn't the type to take a loss lightly. Even now he could picture him, bleeding, humiliated, his pride ground into the dirt like a discarded cigarette. And men like that, they didn't just walk away. Not for good. They regrouped, they planned, they came back. And when they did, they didn't come alone. The door to the diner swung open again, and for the briefest moment the entire room tensed. But it wasn't Red, or the Black Wolves. It was Jesse. He stood in the doorway, hesitating, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn denim jacket. His face was younger than the others, smoother, untouched by the same kind of hard living that had left its mark on Red and the rest of his crew. But his eyes, those carried something older, a quiet uncertainty, a wariness that hadn't been there before. The truckers fell silent again, watching. The waitress froze mid-step, her gaze flicking to Stallone. Jesse exhaled, stepping further inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. He didn't look at anyone else, just Stallone. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. Stallone studied him. "Done what?" Jesse shifted, running a hand through his hair, agitated. "You know what?" Stallone leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "They were looking for a fight," he said. "They found one." Jesse shook his head. "It's not that simple. It never is." For a long moment, Jesse didn't say anything. He just stood there, shoulders tense, his weight shifting between his feet like he wasn't sure if he wanted to stay or run. He glanced toward the parking lot, his fingers twitching in his pockets. Then, finally, he looked back at Stallone. He's not going to let this go. Stallone nodded, unsurprised. Jesse exhaled through his nose, jaw tightening. "And next time," he said, his voice quieter now, "he won't just bring the guys you saw tonight. He's going to call in the rest of the club, and they're not going to fight fair." The room was silent again. The waitress swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the rag she had been using to wipe the counter. The truckers exchanged uneasy glances. Stallone didn't move, didn't speak. Jesse let out a frustrated breath. "I don't even know why I came back here," he muttered. He shook his head, running a hand over his face. "I guess I just wanted to warn you." Stallone nodded. "Appreciate it." Jesse huffed a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, well, don't mention it." He turned, heading back toward the door. Then he paused. "Well, you know," he said, glancing over his shoulder, "you could just leave. Get back on the road. This ain't your fight." Stallone met his eyes. It is now. Jesse studied him for a long moment, then sighed, shaking his head. You're crazy, old man. Stallone almost smiled. You're probably right. Jesse lingered for another second, then pushed open the door, stepping back out into the night. The sound of his boots faded into the quiet hum of the highway. The waitress let out a slow breath, rubbing at her arms. Well, she murmured, that's not ominous or anything. Stallone glanced toward the window, watching as Jesse disappeared down the road. Outside, the desert stretched on in every direction, vast and empty. Somewhere out there, Red was nursing his wounds, planning, waiting. It wasn't over, not yet. But Stallone had never been the type to back down. He wasn't about to start now. The hum of the highway stretched into the distance, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desert. The neon glow of the diner's sign flickered, buzzing faintly in the quiet. Inside, the tension had begun to dissipate, but the weight of the night still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Stallone stood near the window, his arms crossed, watching the darkness beyond the parking lot. The last few hours had unraveled into something he hadn't planned for, but he knew how these things went. He had seen it before, in 100 different places, under 100 different skies. Men like Red didn't just disappear. They regrouped. They called in favors. They came back meaner, angrier, and ready to finish what they had started. Jesse's warning wasn't just words. It was a certainty. The Black Wolves weren't done with him. Behind the counter, the waitress moved slowly, stacking the last of the dishes, her hands still trembling slightly. The truckers had settled back into their meals, though their conversations were hushed, their eyes flicking toward Stallone every so often. The old man with the mustache, the one who had watched everything unfold with quiet amusement, finally spoke. So, he said, tapping his spoon against the rim of his coffee cup, what's next? Stallone didn't turn from the window. Depends. On what? He let the silence stretch for a moment. On how stupid they are. The old man chuckled, shaking his head. Son, I think we both know the answer to that. The waitress shot him a sharp look, but he just shrugged. A man's pride will get him killed quicker than a bullet, he muttered. Seen it 100 times. Stallone knew he was right. Pride was the real danger here. More than fists, more than knives, more than any weapon a man could hold. It was the thing that made men come back when they should have walked away. It made them double down, throw themselves into fights they knew they couldn't win, because the alternative, accepting defeat, was worse than death. Red had that kind of pride, and that made him dangerous. The sound of a truck engine starting outside broke the quiet. One of the truckers was leaving, climbing into his rig, the headlights sweeping across the parking lot as he pulled onto the road. Stallone watched the taillights fade into the night. He could leave too. That thought had been lingering at the back of his mind since Jesse walked out. Just get in the car, drive, put another 100 miles between himself and this place before Red and his men had a chance to find him again. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way the waitress had looked at him when Red grabbed her wrist, the way the truckers had kept their heads down, pretending not to hear the threats, the laughter, the sharp edge in the bikers' voices. Maybe it was the fact that places like this, towns like this, had a way of attracting men like Red, men who thought they owned whatever ground they walked on. Or maybe it was just because Stallone had spent too many years watching the wrong people win. The waitress stepped out from behind the counter, hesitating for a moment before crossing the diner. She stopped a few feet away from him, rubbing her arms against the chill of the night air drifting through the door. You sure you want to be here when they come back? He finally turned to her. You want me to leave? She exhaled, shaking her head. That's not what I meant. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. She shifted on her feet. I don't think you understand how bad this could get. I do. She swallowed. Then why stay? He didn't answer right away. Outside, the darkness pressed in, deep and endless, stretching far beyond the reach of the diner's weak lights. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its cry long and mournful. Because somebody has to. The words were simple, matter of fact. The waitress looked at him for a long time, then sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. You're a stubborn old man, you know that? Stallone almost smiled. So I've been told. She shook her head, but there was something softer in her expression now. At least get some sleep, she muttered. If they're coming back, you'll need it. She wasn't wrong. He nodded again, stepping away from the window. You should lock up, he said. She hesitated, glancing toward the door. They might break it down. Let them try. She gave him another look, but didn't argue. As she turned to start closing up for the night, Stallone moved toward the exit. The truckers watched him go, their faces unreadable. He didn't need their words. He knew what they were thinking. Out in the parking lot, the night air was crisp, the temperature finally dropping after the heat of the day. The motel sat across the lot, its neon vacancy sign buzzing faintly. A single-story row of rooms, the paint peeling, the windows dimly lit. He made his way toward it, his boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, the room was as expected. Small, cheap, barely furnished. A bed with a faded quilt, a nightstand with an old lamp, a dresser with a television that probably hadn't worked in years. A bathroom in the corner, the tiles cracked, the mirror slightly warped. It was enough. He set his keys on the nightstand, shrugged off his jacket, and sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet, but his mind wasn't. Red would be coming back. And this time it wouldn't be 6 men. It wouldn't be a half-hearted attempt to scare him. It would be something real. He had seen this before. In bars, in alleys, in towns where men thought their numbers made them untouchable. It always played out the same way. And it always ended the same way, too. He leaned back against the headboard, closing his eyes for a moment. His body ached, the night's fight catching up to him. He wasn't young anymore, that much was clear, but he wasn't done either, not yet. The sound of distant engines rumbled somewhere in the night, far off but coming closer. Not tonight, but soon. He let out a slow breath, his fingers resting lightly against the quilt. Then, finally, he slept. The night passed in silence, but the silence was not peaceful. It was the kind that sat heavy in the air, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled, their eerie cries weaving through the stillness like a warning. The wind carried the scent of dust and asphalt, rolling over the cracked pavement of the empty highway. Stallone lay on the stiff mattress of the motel bed, his eyes closed but his mind awake. He hadn't expected sleep to come easily, and it hadn't. Years of experience had taught him that nights like these weren't meant for rest. They were meant for waiting, for listening, for feeling the shift in the air when trouble was near. And trouble was near. The low, distant growl of motorcycles came first, so faint that most would have mistaken it for the wind. But he knew better. He could hear the rhythm of the engines, the way they rumbled in sync, growing louder as they moved closer. It was measured, controlled, no reckless revving, no aimless roaring. This wasn't a group of drunk bikers looking for trouble. This was a group of men coming to finish what had been started. Stallone sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He reached for his boots, pulling them on slowly, taking his time. The quiet buzz of the motel's old ceiling fan clicked above him, moving sluggishly in the stale air. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the stiffness from the fight in the diner settle deeper into his muscles. He glanced toward the window. The neon light of the motel sign flickered against the glass, casting red and white shadows across the walls. The parking lot outside was still empty, but that wouldn't last much longer. The black wolves were coming. He stood, reaching for his jacket, sliding it on with a practiced motion. His fingers lingered near the collar, a habit more than anything, before he turned toward the door. He didn't grab a weapon. He didn't need one. If tonight was going to end, it was going to end the way it was meant to. Outside, the first set of headlights appeared on the horizon. Then another, and another. A dozen motorcycles, maybe more, rolling toward the motel in a formation that spoke of experience. These weren't just some local thugs looking to prove themselves. These were men who had done this before. Men who knew how to make a statement. The tires crunched against the gravel as they pulled into the lot, engines snarling before settling into a low, idle rumble. The night swallowed the noise, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. Stallone stepped onto the porch, his boots pressing into the creaky wooden planks. The night air was cool against his skin, carrying the smell of exhaust and burnt rubber. Red was the first to dismount. He moved slower than before, still favoring his side where Stallone's blows had landed hours earlier. But his posture hadn't lost its arrogance. If anything, it had hardened, sharpened by the humiliation he had suffered. Behind him, the others followed suit, boots hitting the gravel, hands resting on weapons that hadn't been drawn yet but were ready to be. Some carried chains. Others had knives tucked into their belts. A few had brass knuckles glinting under the dim motel lights. This wasn't a warning. This was a war party. Red stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the ground. His lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing friendly in it. "You had your chance, old man," he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it now, something darker. Stallone didn't respond. He just watched, waited. Red took another step. "I don't know what kind of life you've had, but around here, we settle things our way." He nodded toward his men. "And you made it personal?" Stallone tilted his head slightly. "Did I?" Red's jaw tightened. "You think this is funny?" A pause. Then, finally, Stallone spoke. "I think you don't know when to walk away." The words were soft, almost too quiet against the hum of the night. But they landed like a hammer. One of Red's men shifted uneasily, glancing between his leader and Stallone. Even in the dim light, it was clear that doubt was starting to creep in. They had all seen what had happened in the diner. They had seen how fast Stallone had put Red down, how easily he had handled 6 men without breaking a sweat. And now there were more of them. But the numbers didn't seem to change anything. Stallone wasn't afraid. He wasn't even tense. He was just standing there, as calm as the night itself. Red saw it too. He clenched his fist, the veins in his arms bulging as his anger swelled past the point of no return. "Enough talk," he snapped. Then he moved. It was faster this time, fueled by rage, but it didn't matter. Stallone sidestepped, pivoting smoothly, and in the same motion he caught Red's arm and twisted. There was a sickening pop. Red's scream shattered the silence, his body dropping to his knees as his shoulder dislocated with brutal efficiency. His fingers clawed at the ground, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The other bikers hesitated. Then chaos erupted. 2 men rushed in at once. Stallone met the first one head-on, driving a fist into his stomach so hard the man folded instantly, collapsing with a choked wheeze. The second swung a chain, but Stallone caught it mid-air, yanking him forward and slamming an elbow into his jaw. The biker crumpled, unconscious before he hit the ground. Another came from behind, a knife flashing under the motel lights. Stallone turned, grabbed the wrist, and twisted. The blade clattered to the gravel. Before the attacker could react, Stallone drove his knee into the man's ribs, sending him sprawling. The rest of them hesitated. The fight was already over, and they knew it. Red was still on the ground, gasping, his face twisted in agony. His men were either unconscious or groaning in the dirt. Stallone exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Then he looked at the remaining bikers. "Pick him up," he said. No one moved. "Now." Slowly, grudgingly, 2 of them stepped forward, grabbing Red under the arms, lifting him to his feet. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, his injured arm hanging limply at his side. "You're done," Stallone said. His voice was quiet. "Next time, you won't walk away." Red's breathing was uneven, his teeth clenched against the pain. But there was no defiance left in his eyes, only fury and humiliation. Stallone turned, stepping back toward the motel door. Behind him, the sound of engines starting filled the night. One by one, the bikers climbed onto their motorcycles, their faces grim. They didn't look back. Stallone didn't watch them go. He didn't need to. He knew they wouldn't be coming back. The last of the engines faded into the distance, swallowed by the endless stretch of highway. Stallone stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle again. Then, with a slow breath, he stepped back inside his room, closed the door behind him, and let the night take back its peace. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out more videos for stories like this, and share this one with others who'd love it. Thanks for watching.